So the first step is to begin working with your oil clay. I've put this in the microwave for about 1.5 minutes to warm it up. It's a little bit easier to work with. And when I say oil clay, that's the term we would use in grad school for plasticine to distinguish it from water clay. It's a little bit of an easier verbal distinction. And you can see this air bubble here and here. It's one of the reasons I like using a small roller and working relatively slowly. Similar to wedging clay, it allows you to get the air bubbles out, get a couple of different directions of compression. Now that I have my slab created, I'll take my measurements. In this case, I'm targeting a 6x8 tile. And because I'll be taking a mold of this, when I make my cut, I'm going to set up my angle so that I will have a natural mold release and no undercuts. I was taught that about a 5-degree angle is what you want. That's kind of the minimum, but I usually don't bother to measure that. Just make sure it has somewhat of an angle. So now I have a 6x8 tile, and I'll spend some time plastic scraper refining those cut edges. Occasionally there will be a small gap that you cut through that was trapped underneath of your oil clay. And that can be where there was a fold initially or an air bubble was trapped as you set the slab down. And those are easily filled with a small coil of clay. A final step, I'm going to come through and barely round all of my corners and all of my edges, and that's for two reasons. It's going to help me in the mold making process. It's going to help the plaster mold actually function a little bit easier for me. Also, the final product in ceramic is going to be a little bit more durable. Any sharp corner is liable to break or chip, and so gently rounding that corner will help alleviate that. And while I don't want sharp corners, I do want defined corners. So where I added that clay, I'll spend some time making that into a nice corner. This is going to be a 1-part mold, and so the face of this oil clay is going to be the face of my finished ceramic piece after it comes out. So I'll take my time and work on refining as many little surface imperfections as I can. I'm pushing very gently. So now I have a 6-inch by 8-inch clay tile, which is ready for building the flask around it. I'm going to give myself maybe an inch, 1.5 inches of a border so that my plaster mold, after it's cast, will have 1 inch or 1.5 inches of body to it. It'll be much more durable that way. If you cast your mold too thinly, then it will be much more likely to break through use and time. And if I were of a mind, I could then add decorations into this surface, and that would be cast. Or I can carve those into the plaster after this piece is cast. And that is the initial step for casting a very simple plaster tile for 1-part mold. Now my tile is 6 inches by 8 inches, so adding 1.5 inches to each side, or 3 inches total, means that I will need walls of my flask that are 11 inches and 9 inches respectively. And as far as my height is concerned, I want to have 2 inches or close to 2 inches of plaster. So I'll add a little extra so I have some wiggle room without the risk of overflowing my flask. So I'll make my walls 3 inches. So these are my 3-inch by 11-inch long side walls. And I'll use this portion to make 3-inch by 9-inch short side walls. And even though I have lines, I always like to cut along a straight edge. I never try to cut all the way through on the first pass. I've found that that usually winds up tearing instead of cutting. I usually make 2 or 3 passes, and that makes a nice clean cut. So these are my 9 by 11 rectangles, and now I will mark my fill line at 2 inches for my plaster. And that will give me a visual cue as to when to stop pouring the plaster. So there we have it. So now to begin building the flask, I'm going to actually mark out where my walls should be, and that's going to help keep my flask square on the mold. And again, it's 1.5 inches on either side. And I like working on this finished particle board surface because it's nice and smooth, but you can still mark on it and clean it up easily afterwards. And with the mold release, both the plaster and the hot glue come off quite easily. So now these are my mold lines, and all that's left is to assemble the mold. I'm going to begin by laying down a bead of hot glue. And placing the cardboard walls onto it, and this will help prevent against leaks at the bottom of my flask. And again, I want to make sure I have my fill line marker on the correct side. When I attach my cardboard, I'm going to hold it just a moment until that hot glue sets up. Essentially, this is tilt wall construction for your flask. And you'll notice I've been coming around my mold with my hot glue strings. I suppose technically they're not a big deal if they're just in this plaster area, but if they were to cross my pattern itself, they would show up in the mold, but also too, they're less to deal with when you clean up your mold. And there is my finished flask for casting a plaster mold of my oil clay pattern.